Can everyone hear me? Excellent. Well, thank you all for coming, and thanks to the Value Foundation for inviting me out here. So I'm talking about where the water tastes like wine, and I'll tell you what that actually means in a second here. But first, a little background about myself and my past work. I worked at Sony Research and Development during the launch of the PS3. Then I helped 2K Games port BioShock to the PS3. I worked on BioShock 2 as a gameplay, UI, and AI programmer, and then helped with DLC for that game. Worked a little bit on the Bureau, XCOM Declassified, and then quit AAA development entirely, founded the Fulbright Company, and worked on Gone Home. I was the sole programmer on that game. And afterwards, I left and I founded Dim Bulb Games, and after about 4 years of work, we released our first game this past February, Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. It's a game about stories and folklore. It's set in the Great Depression era of American history, sort of. I'll get back to that in a little bit. It's unlike any other narrative games in that it doesn't prioritize a strong central narrative. Instead, the stories come from all these 16 different characters that we have who the player meets in their travels. Each character was written by a different person and drawn from some historical archetype, sort of. And then in addition to these 16 characters, the game contains over 200 small adventures for the player. We call them vignettes. These are more freeform and are fictional, again, sort of. So here's a quick trailer for the game to give you more of an idea. Let's see if I can start that. We are not hearing audio.
This land is built on stories.
Oh, we are.
It's
Good.
one big story, America is, woven of many small ones. All the stories and songs and myths and legends start somewhere with a seed. As they're told and retold and passed around, they grow and change to become the stories we know. Wander the land, explore, meet people, gather stories and spread and share them. The most important stories are the true ones, the ones people will tell you about their own lives. I hope you find what you're looking for.
All right, so that's what the game is. In the fiction of the game, the player has been compelled to a task. They lost a bet, which is why you should never play poker with mysterious strangers. And now they have a job. They're the personification of folklore. They're the thing that moves stories from place to place, that carries the threads of these tales around and ensures that they grow. The way they do this is by having these little adventures, the vignettes that I mentioned earlier. They get to choose their path through an encounter, but the choices don't change much about the character. Instead, they determine what kind of story you get out of it. So perhaps one choice makes it a love story, while another makes it a tragedy. The player can take these stories, and when they meet one of the game's 16 characters, they can tell the story to them, and in return, they'll get a piece of that character's story. So if you tell a love story, they'll get back a piece of the character's story on the subject of love, for example. These characters are a diverse group of drifters and travelers. The only thing in common between them is that they're on the road, and they're all looking for something in the metaphorical wasteland of the Great Depression United States. So there we go. Where the Water Tastes Like Wine is a work of fiction set in a real historical time period. It's a work that draws extensively on historical research, and it's an attempt to make political and moral statements about the current era of US history. It's not, however, and is not striving towards being historically accurate. Before getting into that, though, I want to talk about the history part of the game, since that's why we're all here, and the work that went into that. So first, the setting of the game. The Great Depression era in the United States. As a refresher, this was a period from about 1929 to 1939, a few short years before the Wild West was over. The spread of settlers westward with their crops and barbed wire put an end to the open range in the era of the cowboy. The indigenous people of the land were brutally suppressed, killed, or relocated to lands no one wanted. The rail network had spread all over the U.S., connecting everywhere in relatively short, easy journeys. The so-called Roaring Twenties were a time of glittering excess, which culminated in the stock market crash of 1929. Along with that economic catastrophe, an environmental one hit as well. The middle of the country suffered from an event known as the Dust Bowl, as bad farming techniques combined with bad weather led to enormous dust storms ravaging the former farming and ranching lands. Banks failed, industrial production fell 45%, and up to 2 million people wandered the land homeless as hobos. We wanted to capture that era, and especially the widespread feelings of despair and struggle. So we did a lot of research on this era, what was going on for average Americans, what the hobo experience was like, what the political landscape was, what happened to the areas hit by the Dust Bowl. References included books like The Worst Hard Times, Father Charles Coughlin, Hammer and Hoe, and various documentaries, as well as some popular fiction about the era, like The Grapes of Wrath. However, even as we were doing all this research to endeavor to fully understand and capture this era, we were also immediately going off the rails. I decided that I wanted to capture the feeling of the American road story, and many of the best of those come from times outside the Great Depression. I wanted characters like a beat poet to bring in Kerouac, and a hippie to reference the disconnection the country felt during the 1960s and 1970s. And we needed certain cities to be around, both for gameplay reasons and also because of their essential Americanness. Las Vegas absolutely had to be in the game, although the modern Sin City of legend didn't really exist at the time. We needed the player to be able to get around quickly, so we made hitchhiking a major mechanic, although this probably made the roads far busier with cars than they would have been during the Depression. I think we got the essence of what we needed, though. We understood the era, and we presented it to the players in a way that felt believable and that fit. Another thing that I haven't mentioned is that the game has a magical folkloric tinge to it at all times. Maybe you picked up on that from the wolf-headed guy in the trailer, which of course only helps us to bend reality. That said, we were absolutely true to history when we were trying to be. The game turns out to be nuggets of well-researched truth in a fantastical broth. Next, I'd like to go into more detail on the process behind creating and researching the characters in the game. Since the game is constructed like an anthology, with the important stories being those of the characters, and the player's goal is built around finding and talking to all the characters, you can see that this is the majority of the work and is critical to the success of the game. In general, the character creation process went like this. I would come up with the idea for the character, do the historical and cultural background research, and then hand the whole process over to a writer. When I specified the constraints for these characters, the writers in general had total creative freedom within those constraints, and even the ability to change those constraints if they wanted. We did this because the entire strength of the anthology approach is the individual writer voices. They need to have the freedom to tell the story they want and the ability to shape the character to fit their needs. The research that I handed them was there to support, as a scaffolding upon which to build the interesting, compelling, and empathetic characters. That research was generally from books, which range from scholarly to popular. I also watched movies, again ranging from serious documentaries to Hollywood's take. For the characters, much more than for the world, though, I was trying to build a solid historical foundation of truth. This is because I knew the information would be filtered twice, once by the writers as they chose what to include in their characters, and once again by the audience, who would see it all through the lens of a conversation around the fire. I wanted to make sure that when we painted a picture of what these people's lives were like, we had some truth to it. There are some common themes for characters in the game, even though they're all from different walks of life. Most of these arose organically out of the theming and goals of the game as a whole. One is that generally, the characters are marginalized by society in some way. The game's explicit goal is surfacing the stories that aren't heard as often, which usually belong to the marginalized. Characters you encounter are immigrants, refugees, non-white, queer, poor, or hold beliefs outside the mainstream. Another theme is that the characters generally are not on the road out of choice. These are not tourists. Everyone traveling in the game is doing so because they have to. They're fleeing something, they've been pushed out of their home, they're seeking opportunities elsewhere, or they have nowhere to settle down. The rosy myth of the romantic open road is called into question. Who gets to choose to travel versus who has to? Everyone here is seeking something impossible. The title of the game is a reference to an American folk song that talks about finding the place where the water tastes like wine. A wonderful goal, but of course, there is no such place. It's similar to the hobo concept of Big Rock Candy Mountain or the legend of Cockaigne. and it's meant to reflect on the expressed ideals of the United States as something that doesn't exist in reality, but instead that the country is constantly striving for. Often, the characters' struggles are related to labor. That wasn't an explicit goal, but something that shook out in the process of researching interesting people in periods of history. It turns out that many of the commonly forgotten events in United States history relate to workers fighting for their rights. Always, the characters are in some way political, although that term is getting very messy in the US these days, where for certain people, merely existing is political. And finally, the character stories are 3 to 4 chapters representing some sort of arc. Sometimes they're a straight chronological retelling of the story, or perhaps they're just getting more and more intimate and true with each chapter. So we can look more in depth at some of the characters that I designed for the game. This is Little Ben. He's a coal miner and a labor union organizer from West Virginia. He's involved in the mine wars, which in West Virginia went from 1912 to 1921. The miners in this area went on strike for better working conditions and wanted recognition from the mine owners for their union, the United Mine Workers, which had formed in 1890. As you can guess from the name of this struggle, the mine wars were not a pleasant or gentle time. The owners responded to the initial strikes by hiring the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, who were less like detectives and more like armed thugs. They carried high-powered rifles and machine guns. In 1920, there's a shootout that began the Battle of Blair Mountain, where the National Guard and the U.S. Army were mobilized against the striking mine workers. This was the largest insurrection since the Civil War in the United States, so it was a big deal, or at least you would think so. This is never taught in American schools, and if you ask an American, chances are good they have no idea this happened. A perfect story for our purposes. Ben here is seeking fairness, honest pay for an honest day. Process-wise, I gathered notes about all these happenings and gave them to the writer, Lee Alexander. She took all that and made a real person out of that, a man who just wants what's fair for him and his companions, who is in love with a school teacher, but on the run from the company thugs, always looking over his shoulder, never able to trust anyone except his fellow miners. This is Quinn. Quinn is just a kid. They're firmly part of the Great Depression, and in fact would not exist without it. As the hard years set in, many families looked at their children and knew they couldn't feed them all. They asked the older children to leave, to seek their future out on the road and find work and feed themselves. Many young people were thus thrust out into the world to make their own way. Of course, this is hard at the best of times, and during the Depression, when no one could find work and trains were overloaded with hobos, it was nearly impossible. Quinn is seen here with 2 dogs and a bare knife. Of course, the road would be hard on children, and it's no wonder they might need to defend themselves. Quinn's story came from a few sources: the PBS documentary Riding the Rails about these displaced children, the book Sister of the Road, an autobiography of Boxcar Bertha, and a few others. I handed them off to Clara Sayeran, who wove an incredible story of the betrayal of a family and a kid who doesn't let you get too close until you earn their trust. Here's another character, Dahiya, a woman of the Diné, more commonly known as the Navajo. When she was a girl, she was a victim of the Long Walk, when the U.S. government decided to subdue the Navajo Nation once and for all. The famous General Christopher Kit Carson attacked the traditional lands of the Navajo, destroying their homes and farms and killing anyone who didn't surrender. The people who did surrender were then forced to march at gunpoint without any aid at all through 300 miles of the harsh desert of the American Southwest, away from their traditional lands and into a harsh and inadequate internment camp that was shared with other indigenous people, including traditional enemies of the Diné. This is a story that, if you ask an American, they may have heard of, possibly. It depends. However, they almost certainly will not know all the details. And our story has another feature. It's related by a Diné writer, using his point of view and his people's history of the event from their side. This is another reason why it was very important to have each writer take control of their character and tell their story as they wanted it told. Very few Americans have heard the Diné's side of things. Those were a few characters who belong in the approximate era of the game, who fit into this world of hobos and railcars and dust. But here's a couple more. First, I mentioned already Cassidy, the beat poet. The Beats were a counterculture group in the 1950s and early 1960s in America. They're most famous as poets and novelists: Allen Ginsberg, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Greg Corso, and Jack Kerouac, William S. Burroughs. But it was really a social movement, too. They were rebelling against the constraints and mores of the stable period of American history, pushing back against the materialism of the age. It was a precursor to the 1960s, and in fact, many of the same figures crop up in the hippie era. But this is way past the defined era of the game. Why did I include this guy? Well, I already talked about the lure of the American Road story and how Kerouac, Ginsberg, and Neil Cassidy epitomize it in various ways. But also thematically, it fits perfectly. These were people questioning the American dream at its very height, who were investigating and elevating the marginalized when the country as a whole was doing just great. The character of Cassidy was written by Matthew S. Burns, and he turns him into a tragic love story, looking at this boundary pushing and when it fails. And just because Cassidy doesn't fit in the Great Depression doesn't mean he's ahistorical. His times were researched just as thoroughly as every other character, and within his own story, he's entirely historically accurate. A different example is Althea, the blues singer. She's sort of a cross between Memphis Minnie and Robert Johnson. Like Memphis Minnie, she's a hard-drinking, hard-living, incredibly talented blues musician. Like Robert Johnson, she sells her soul to the devil at the crossroads. At least that's the myth of Robert Johnson. In the world of Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, of course, that fits right in. And so the devil is literal and real, and Althea really does sell her soul to him. She's obviously from a historical background, but it would be stretching the truth a little bit to claim that the devil on the right side of rigorous historical research. Luckily, I gave the character of Althea to Gita Jackson, who's an amazingly talented writer. She turned the devil into a metaphor while keeping him literal. So yes, Althea sells her soul, but she does it because a black woman in the South at this time has limited options. Every deal she could make, with record companies, with society, with anyone white, they were all devil's bargains. So she may as well take the literal bargain and tell us how the devil is just as dishonest as any white man she's ever known. This magical folkloric intrusion into the historical story helps us underline the point of what it might truly have been like to be Memphis Minnie, powerless and taken advantage of on all sides by beings who care nothing for her and have limitless power. Another in the same vein is Fidelina, a New Mexican curandera, a healer, one who uses a combination of folk medicine, religious faith, and good magic. She tells you matter-of-factly about her battles with brujas, the bad witches who wish only to destroy. Whether or not the player or the world believes in the magic of these witches, it's plain that Fidelina does, and her struggle, her conflict, is that the new generation doesn't believe in the old ways. They're becoming modern Americans. They don't listen to the tales of brujas, or believe in charms, or herbs, or prayer. Again, Fidelina is in the right time period, and she's drawn from history. It doesn't matter whether the magic she talks about is real or not, although in the context of the game, it would certainly not be out of place. It's being used as a lens for her to discuss the loss of traditional ways of life. This is made all the more poignant by the fact that she lives in an area of the country, where I live now, that first belonged to the Pueblo people, then Spain, then Mexico, and then the US. She's become an American not by moving there, but by having the land underneath change ownership. In a similar fashion, the grounds underneath her beliefs and traditions shift away from her by larger external forces. I want to briefly mention the vignettes in the game, which I touched on before. As I said, these had way more free reign than the characters. The writers for these got a piece of art and a selection of story categories that we needed the events to fit into. Sometimes we started with a traditional American folktale, like Pecos Bill or Johnny Appleseed. So as you can picture, the writer's imagination was really allowed to play here. We had fishmen catching and eating humans, tentacle monsters in boxes, cursed violins. But the historical nature of the game and its themes crept in here too. An image of a metal worker becomes a member of the Alabama Communist Party, secretly organizing. A story about Seattle focuses on the West Coast waterfront strike. Johnny Appleseed was a real person, John Chapman, and his story becomes about his love of nature and his religious beliefs. It was sneaking a little bit of lesser-known history even into these wild adventures. The very last thing I want to talk about is something that I've alluded to throughout this talk, the boogeyman of historical accuracy. This is something that's getting a lot of attention in games these days in a really negative way. It's become a front in the ongoing worldwide culture wars. Just recently, Total War Rome 2 came under fire for the fact that sometimes players' generals can be female. Red Dead Redemption 2 is being attacked for its black cowboys. At the same time, Kingdom Come: Deliverance was lauded by the same folks for its commitment to historical accuracy. In each of these cases, what is actually being pursued is a longing for the status quo, for history as it's been told to us by the people in power, by the victors. Never it is questioned whether this view of history is actually accurate or who might have benefited from constructing a particular narrative. In reality, what is sought is validation for those in power to remain in power and for those suffering to continue to suffer, ideally in silence. I think I've made it clear throughout this talk that Where the Water Tastes Like Wine wholeheartedly rejects this notion. It's a game that loves history, that thrives in it and celebrates it, but it doesn't worship it. It uses history to lift up people who have never had their stories told to the same degree as others. The player's mission in the game is explicitly to uncover forgotten or downplayed narratives and to elevate them to the same status as the understood historical record. And this mirrors the game's mission, which is to do the same. Regardless, our goal is not to be accurate. That is an empty goal, and one that is naive at best or self-serving at worst. What could accuracy possibly mean, and who gets to judge it? Our goal was to interrogate American society and our current moment by using history to point out that the problems we're having now, we've always had, that for some of them we found solutions in the past that we've since forgotten, and to bring these lesser-known moments of history to light. We were accurate at some levels, and not at all at others, but I hope that in the end we made something compelling, challenging, and exciting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johnnemann. We have time for a question now. We are going to have a wrap-up discussion at the end of the session, but for the sake of timekeeping, we're going to limit it to one question now. If there is a question on the back. I'm not going to throw it all the way from down here. I'm going to throw it from here, though. Yes.
Hello, thank you very much. That was really fascinating. I've got a question that's based on complete ignorance, which is, I was told that one of the problems when creating video games is not to have too much text on a screen at any given point. And you've got a wonderful character-based story, and you obviously want to tell that story through what's on the screen, through audio, etc. And I just wonder if you could talk briefly about how you make the call about how much text your audience can handle to still get that story, but not be turned off by seeing reams of text.
Yeah, I'm probably the wrong person to ask on that, actually, because I sort of set out from the very beginning to make this a literary game for literary gamers, and I said that I wanted it to be something that people would glory in reading the text of, things like that. So I actually did set up to make it a kind of very readable game. Near the end of development, we decided to add voice acting, so all the characters are voice acted. But if you don't like reading stories or listening to stories for a long period of time, this is probably not the game for you, is what I would say. We balanced it a little bit by having, again, the voice acting and then the gorgeous art that you could see through the talk. Most of that was art from actually within the game.
Well, thank you. Yeah. I actually find it really reassuring that there's clearly a market for that kind of literary game.
Not as large of a market as I would hope, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But
thank you.